What is not known is whether the world will be a safer place after the Geneva media blitz.
With us now is Josh Meyrowitz, professor of communications at the University of New Hampshire and the author of No Sense of Place, The Impact of the Electronic Media on Personal Behavior. Welcome. What sort of an impact does 3,000 reporters have on this business of a summit?
Well, I think that having the presence of journalists, especially television journalists, removes the summit from Geneva. The summit doesn't simply take place in Geneva, but Geneva has become a backdrop for a drama that's played out on a much larger stage, the stage of world television sets.
Are we in danger then of trivializing the summit?
I think that we do see a whole change in the summit and diplomacy in general as a result of television. We see a change in the faces and the places of diplomacy, in the style and structure of it. And it's certainly true now that very important issues, such as the future of our species, has been reduced to discussions of who has the nicer smile and the more stylishly dressed wife. And I think that there is some danger of reducing complex issues to those types of surface phenomena.
Well, reporters are limited after all. The discussions go on behind closed doors.
Well, it's certainly true that most of the important discussions still take place in private, but we can't eliminate the fact that there's a whole new public dimension to diplomacy that never existed before. In fact, the situation as it exists now reminds me of an episode from the old Star Trek series where an alien leader makes an appeal, a demand to Captain Kirk through the ship's two-way television system. Captain Kirk refuses to comply with this, and so the alien leader addresses his crew directly and asks them to make the decision, and this starts discussion among the crew. And I think we're seeing the same thing in international diplomacy now, in that while all of diplomacy used to take place through private channels, now there's a whole dimension of appeal to the public opinion, both of one's own country and of the other leader's country.
Would that give Mr. Gorbachev the edge, then, in that he can more closely control the media in his country?
Yes, I think that we do see that Gorbachev has a distinct advantage here in that he has, to the extent that he can, closed off the channels from Ronald Reagan to the Russian people, while Gorbachev is able to, let's say, recently travel to Paris and use that as a way of addressing American public opinion. But at the same time, there is something about the power of television itself that, and electronic media in general, that seems to override those constraints. And I think that's the reason that the Soviets felt forced to come up with someone who was good on TV.
Well, let's talk about that. Is Gorbachev good on TV? How does he come across?
I think he comes across very well. He comes across personally. He seems like a nice guy. It's interesting that we've seen a similar evolution in the leaders of many countries. Now we have three major world ideologies: American capitalism, Soviet communism, and also Vatican Catholicism, represented by amiable televisual leaders who have nice smiles and steel teeth. That is, they're very traditional leaders, they talk tough, but they seem very personable and nice, and they wave and they smile, and they're very accessible to journalists and to the public. And I think that we've now seen a change, not necessarily one that will give a distinct advantage to one side or another, but a change in the whole way in which the game of diplomacy is played.
Which is not talking to each other necessarily, but talking to a world audience.
Right. The leaders now use television as a way of talking through people to the other leader, and when they travel to a certain place, it's a parallel to what's happened in national politics. For example, Ronald Reagan recently traveled to my home state of New Hampshire to speak about tax reform. But he wasn't coming to speak to people from New Hampshire. He was really coming to use New Hampshire as a backdrop and people from New Hampshire as extras in his drama and his plea to Congress and the nation for tax reform. And we see the same thing in the international arena, where Gorbachev goes to Paris, not to speak to Parisians, but to speak to Americans, to speak to Ronald Reagan, to try to limit Ronald Reagan's options, to send back pictures of himself being treated royally to his own people, to impress his own people. So you have electronic media and television in particular having very little respect for place. Where things happen doesn't seem to matter as much. They're used as backdrops for larger dramas.
Well, as long as you've touched on it, to what do you attribute the president's apparent failure with the tax reform program?
Well, it's interesting. That day when he was in New Hampshire, I think Ronald Reagan made a terrible mistake. And as at the very beginning of his speech, he mentioned the release of the hostage from Lebanon that day, and that got picked up on all the network news, and not much of his speech got picked up outside of New Hampshire. In New Hampshire, it was a very big event. Outside of New Hampshire, it was hardly covered at all. And so he failed, really, one of his few failures with the media, in that he ended up basically speaking to people in New Hampshire when he wanted to speak to a much broader audience.
Well, I suppose it's good then for a person like you who analyzes these things to know that there's still an element of surprise here, that as much as the world leaders will try to control what the public sees, there still can be something go wrong, can't there?
Yes, television, as we all know, live TV is like dancing on a tightrope. You can wow people with your performance that you don't fall, and yet you can also have a terrible slip, and things can go very, very wrong.
And all this is not necessarily on the bad side. I mean, television and through these efforts we've seen everybody to be telegenic, it has informed the world more, hasn't it?
Yes, I think that on the good side is that it's now much more difficult for governments to give the extremes of propaganda that they used to, in that even behind the Soviet Iron Curtain, there is more access to information from outside. It's been estimated, for example, that 80% of East Germans can receive Western television. Satellite dishes are being sold in Hungary and other countries. So we're seeing an opening up of that. In the same way, the State Department in our country is unable now to give the kind of vile anti-communist propaganda that it was giving us in the 50s. There is something humanizing about the images we see of Gorbachev, even of Khrushchev, some time ago. And ideologies really exist in language. They don't exist in pictures. Television tends to transform ideologies into bodies, and we respond to the humanity of the people. Okay. And I think it's much more difficult to rally people to push the button to blow up Gorbachev and his wife than it would be to blow up an evil empire.
An encouraging note.
Thank you, Professor, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.